Hey everyone, welcome to Jitters. Get ready to be spooked because today we're exploring some truly mind-boggling stories from Reddit. These unexplainable encounters will leave you chilled to the bone and wondering what's real. So without further ado, let's get into these incredible unexplainable Reddit stories. My friend works for the city's CCTV archives and has seen some disturbing things. I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work, and our usual weekend nights out had about disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse as we drank. I finally asked what'd been going on with him. He said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I did know he worked for the city in the tech department and was involved with the CCTV surveillance network, but I never knew what his day-to-day operations were, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained there were thousands of cameras scattered throughout the downtown core, outlying neighborhoods, and well into the suburbs of our 1 million-plus city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into very general classifications and were saved in hard-drive farms and identified with a lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorical archiving. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was an expansive task, but Mike designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, then sectioned out anomalous behavior for review. The vast majority wasn't noteworthy, something like 90.99%. Then there was the 0.01%, the car accidents, assaults, swarmings, rapes, abductions, murders. Those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigations. And then there was the 0.0001%. They were held in a classified archive and contained footage capturing events that, for all accounts, were unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I looked up the word Tartarus after and discovered it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons from Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach the earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place you sent titans when there was nowhere else that could contain them. When Sisyphus was condemned to an eternity of futility and frustration with a large boulder and a mountain slope, that punishment was carried out in Tartarus. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting to the archive's growing contents. Some footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera and coincidences of light or crackheads on a bender through the subway systems. Other footage, though, defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations and editing them into linear sequences. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way. It felt more like the sharing of a heavy burden kind of way. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved the idea away. I said, yeah, obviously I want to see what's going on in my city. Mike led me into his workroom where he had monitors and towers and piles of externals set up. We sat down and he skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the largest screen, black and white footage started up, showing Lincoln Avenue, one of our less attractive downtown streets, at 3 a.m. The camera angle showed the length of Lincoln Ave as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared empty and quiet. From a side road, a woman emerged, walking towards the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, sprinting past the camera, which cut to a new wider angle from another camera across the street. We watched a woman running frantically, seemingly being chased. But she was the only one on the street. There was no one else anywhere around her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and the cameras kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as the woman was chased into the middle of an empty intersection. She fell, then cowered as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened and she began to levitate off the ground. Her body looked like a rag doll as something lifted her by the throat until she was floating a dozen feet above the road in the middle of the intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left and her body fell back to the ground. The video ended and went black. I sat shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if that was real, if what I saw was unaltered, was raw footage. Mike said all he'd done was put the clips together, none of the content had been touched. He told me he found out the incident ended up being described as a hit and run and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass. Which it never would. The department kept the footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video of how the poor woman actually died. I started to understand the air of soberness Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway systems at the underground Walkley station shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was shouldered by a new housing development on one side and untouched forests and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side and showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end, the tunnel was filled with darkness. The lights on the platform shut off and the station went dark. The camera switched to night vision and everything became visible again. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, as its movements were strange and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera and I got a better look. He resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched and his stomach pointed to the ceiling. He had long, dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore tattered layers of old jackets and torn pants. He moved like a crab, jerkily yet quickly and easily, as he made his way to the staircase. The footage cut to a new camera in the dark hallway leading to the stairs out of the station. We watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time and then crawl over the turnstiles and towards the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the station entrance. The crab walker squeezed and twisted and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance gate. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he did it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off towards the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth. The animal looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled through the station, and disappeared into the subway tunnel. Again, Mike saw my expression and told me there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour long. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the video towards the end, and we watched the crab walker come out of a sewer in a downtown alleyway. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped into them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped, and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera's view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker was who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with a family. One Christmas, there was a house fire, and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He lost everything, including his mind. Everyone has a breaking point whether they know it or not, a place where they bend too far and then snap. David found his. Family and friends described his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the streets, became addicted to drugs, and tumbled into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years prior. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkley station, and no one heard from or saw him again. It appeared that, somehow, David had survived the subway hit. His back had broken and healed strangely, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture and lived in the darkness of the subway tunnels, finding sustenance from drain water and the wild animals he caught. That was what Mike found out, at least, but then he said that was just the answer the investigators gave in Discovery. Who knows where the truth lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he saw. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew, but the ones that had to become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged a new hard drive in, he poured a fresh drink, and told me this was the one that was troubling him. The file was codenamed Cloud Mirror. I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown on the exact date and time as each other. There were 5 in total. The streets on each screen were empty and quiet. No cars or people. Suddenly, at the exact same time, in the center of the intersections, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. The streetlights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball. Then it flashed out, the streetlights went back to normal, and the intersection was as lifeless as it was before. I asked Mike what they were. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orbs and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were, at first. Then they started to change. Mike clicked onto the next video. Again, the 5 monitors lit up with the same intersections and time of night, but several weeks later, the streetlights glowed and pulsed and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew to its beach ball size, but then altered its surface and glow. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of dark gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small clouds in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. They were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled outward from a glowing center, resembling a Mandelbulb fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stoplights and street lamps. Then they began to move, gliding down empty roads. The cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown path, zigging and zagging onto new streets and through alleyways. Then they'd stop. The clouds hovered in the center of their intersection. They'd lower to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin. Holding rigid to the shape, their exteriors continued to shift and mold together, like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the cloud and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entity, so much so they were approaching it. As they did, the cloud became brighter. The street lamps around it pulsed. The group were in some kind of trance, staring into the morphing blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and another, and another. All 5 members of the group disappeared in the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time, the guy first, then in the order they went in. Only They weren't stumbling and boisterous and drunk now. They were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed in a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds over quick words, then turned and all went in separate directions. Their strides, arm swings, and speed all matched. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a larger group of people, lost in reverie as they marched, one after another, into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing now, people entering the clouds and coming back out. Different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone else. He said he hadn't, not even to his one boss, which was a problem, because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more than serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week. One of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple were walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp in his right leg. The couple saw the cloud and were sucked in by its aura. They approached it, eyes wide and mouths open. Both the husband and wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared. The husband's limp was gone. Mike turned to me and said that was my boss and his wife. I work in the City of Toronto archives. I found this creepy article written in the 80s. In the year 1993, in Toronto, Canada, a pair of twins were born to an affluent family, the Mullocks. They were named Eve and Lilith. In almost every respect, these twins appeared to be like any other babies. However, after several strange feeding sessions with the mother, a few notable differences were found. One child, Eve, was a particularly voracious eater. Her mother would be left exhausted after every feeding and would need to feed the other baby, Lilith, first to ensure she'd be fed at all. Strangely, as well as her insatiable appetite, Eve would never spit up. The process is quite common for babies, a small amount of vomit here and there, typically after feeding, but despite gorging at every opportunity, she had never let a drop spill from her lips. The behavior of the twins had begun to grow more and more concerning, as Lilith started to develop an emaciated appearance. She would sway when sitting still, struggling to keep her balance. Lilith also would become very fussy when it came to feeding time. She wouldn't eat regularly, which concerned the parents, who attributed it to her sister's gluttony. As time went on, they hired a live-in wet nurse to help assist with Eve's hunger. She had begun to grow in size, both in girth and height, and her mother couldn't hardly keep up. Meanwhile, Lilith's emaciation would not be rectified through normal means. The parents had decided it was reasonable to keep regular appointments with the doctor. The doctor had found small peculiarities in both children. Eve was noticeably large for her age, appearing to be the size of a generously overweight toddler at the age of 2 months. The doctor assured the parents that there was little concern to be had there, as she probably just needed to be weaned off of her excessive eating habits. Lilith was excessively fragile, as if growing thinner with every passing day. The doctor informed them that this kind of thing wasn't altogether totally uncommon in the womb, but there's no reason that kind of disproportionate nutrition should be happening after birth, especially with both children having the same access to food. Lilith also had a peculiar smell, unlike any a baby should possess. She always carried a faint aroma of ethyl alcohol. At the doctor's advice, the parents attempted to feed Eve less frequently and in less abundance. The result was an unyielding cacophony of protest from the child. Once she was hungry, if she was cut off before she'd had more than 4 average babies' share, she threw excessive tantrums. She would howl and wail for hours on end, only pausing briefly to catch her breath. The parents kept up with it as best they could, but in many circumstances it grew too agonizing to bear, and they would give in, feeding the child to her contentment. At 6 months, Eve began to walk. It wasn't uncommon in their family for children to walk before their first birthday, but 6 months was record-breaking for them. She wouldn't spend much time on her feet, but her ability to move was astonishing. It was also peculiar that she had already fully formed all of her baby teeth, which appeared to be abnormally large and dark. Poor little Lilith, on the other hand, would never take a step in her life. She was eternally bedbound, lacking even the basic strength to crawl. Her pathetic frame looked like she would simply pass away at any second. When she would attempt to cry, little more than raspy screeches would leave her lips. Late in the evening, during one of the parents' more stoic attempts at staving off Eve's appetite, something peculiar occurred. She stopped screaming. Both parents, delighted with the turn of events, were happily able to return to sleep. The next morning, when they entered the nursery where both babies slept, they found something terrifying. To this day, details are debated, but a few facts and issues seem substantiated. The air was thin, hard to breathe, and smelled of a combination of alcohol and advanced decomposition. Baby Lilith was still in her crib, silent as a church mouse. Eve was on the floor, hunched over the eviscerated corpse of the wet nurse. Some accounts claim that Eve had been eating the flesh of the wet nurse, but the family has vehemently denied those claims. Other accounts claim that the wet nurse stunk of liquor when she was found, giving way that she may have been drinking that night and was hiding her habit from the family. The Moolocks were staunch supporters of the temperance movement in Toronto. According to the Moolocks' account, someone had snuck into the house and tortured and disfigured the wet nurse before leaving. Strangely, nothing of value was reported to have been taken, and no sign of a break-in was evident. Details of the event of the wet nurse's demise eventually found their way into the eyes of the public. Printed in one of the city's most reputable newspapers, the story of the two infants began to gain notoriety. Eve and Lilith had been given the names Butter and Scotch, respectively. The negative press affected the patriarch, Stuart Moolock, quite significantly in his business dealings. It also drastically harmed the family's livelihood up until the night of the Great Toronto Fire. On the evening of April 19th, 1904, the twins were left with a relative of the family, Joseph, who owned a wholesale store on the northwest corner of Bay and Wellington. At 8:04 p.m., the first sightings of the Great Fire of Toronto were reported. A large chunk of the Bay Street corridor was lost in the flames, including the wholesale store the twins were in, with their uncle. No one really knows the cause of the fire. Records show that there were no official victims claimed, as most of the buildings were empty shops or business buildings. But unidentified remains were found in the basement of Joseph's wholesale building, which is also believed to have been the origin point of the fire from an upstairs. The remains appeared to be that of an adult male, presumed to have been Joseph, but no skull was found, so dental records could not be corroborated. All flesh was stripped from the bones. Claims supported by the family are that he was consumed by the fire and the skull obliterated by falling rubble. But according to the volunteer firefighters who helped clear the ruins, there was no indication the fire had spread to the basement in any capacity that could have cleaned the flesh off of a human corpse. Neither Eve nor Lilith were found. They were assumed to have died and their remains lost in the rubble, unrecognized and unclaimed during the cleanup of the fire's aftermath. There's a rumor circulating that in the early summer night, you may smell smoke if you walk down Bay Street. Sometimes, people swear that they hear the howls of a hungry baby accompanied by the acrid scent of alcohol permeating the air. My final call as a police dispatcher has scarred me. I had worked as a police dispatcher for 9 years of my life. It's a career that takes a level of mental fortitude that I don't think many possess. I used to hate saying stuff like that, always thought it sounded so pretentious. But the truth is, it takes a special type of person to be willing to voluntarily listen to some of the things we have to hear every single day. Don't get me wrong, the job wasn't always grim, and it even had its decent moments. I've got enough decently funny, drunk 911 call stories to last me several lifetimes, though the reality of the job was usually far darker. I understood that, though, and felt that I was more than equipped to deal with anything the job could throw at me. I was right for a while. For years, I had answered every call, always able to keep a steady head despite being faced with some horrific situations. My confidence in my ability to handle the job, unwavering. Until the final call I ever took as a police dispatcher. I glanced at the time displayed at the corner of my computer screen, 11:43. I yawned, leaning backward in my chair with my arms extended as I stretched my back. I'd been at the desk since 3 in the afternoon, answering calls and dispatching officers as they were needed, which wasn't very often in this town. I lived in a little port town in Washington, about an hour or so out of Seattle, and though we weren't without our fair share of crime, our phones never rang off of the hook, which meant a lot of free time for me. I was always okay with that. As soul-wrenching as many of the calls could be, moments of respite were always more than welcome. A notification on my screen caught my attention, and in an instant I had returned to my seat, headset on. 911, what is your emergency? I spoke into my headset as automatically as any line repeated hundreds or thousands of times can be spoken. For a moment, the line was only dead silence before I heard a reply. I need policemen. I think somebody is in my house, a child whispered from the other line. I felt the smallest of knots beginning to form in my stomach. I shifted in my seat. Do you know your address? I asked, adopting a firm but lighter tone in response to the caller's age. I heard shuffling and heavy breathing from the other end, followed by a faint wait. The caller returned and whispered their address. She was a little girl by the sounds of her voice, and she sounded scared. Good job, what about your phone number? The process repeated, and I quickly relayed her information to dispatched officers. Her address was on the edge of town, a little out of the way, and I understood that it may be a while before help arrived. I stifled a sigh, not wanting to vocalize my worry as I received an estimated arrival time. Is there an adult with you in the house? I continued. No, the little girl replied breathlessly, and I could hear the anxiety rising in her voice as she spoke. My mom works late, and my sister... There was a pause, followed by an audible sniffle. I was camping with her friends, and somewhere on her end of the line there was a crash, then a scream. My heart dropped. Are you still there? Are you all right? There was a repetitive thumping sound followed by the slam of a door. I'm here, the little girl spoke breathlessly into the phone. Are you all right? I repeated the question. Yes is all she replied, barely above a whisper. Her tone worried me. She sounded more than afraid. Sad? No, disturbed was the proper word for it. Then she began to cry, not as quiet as you would expect given her situation, but a deep, helpless sob that made my heart sink. When she spoke, it stopped altogether. Please, please, please help me! Her sobs turned into a hysteric cry, and I could hear loud, repetitive thumps from her end. Footsteps, and they were clearly not hers. They were heavy, far too heavy for a little girl. Without warning, a shrill cry, like the sound of microphone feedback, rang through my headsets. The sudden assault on my ears caused me to jump, and my heart set off to racing like a jackrabbit. Then, I fought the instinct to throw the headset off, and instead clenched my eyes shut, as the noise faded as suddenly as it had come. I saw it. She sputtered through sobs. Oh, please, please, I don't know what it is. The frantic and frenzied nature of her begging increased, and a strangeness began to settle in the air that I couldn't quite place. A quick glance around the room confirmed that most of the desks around me were empty, and I was on the call alone. The thought made me feel very isolated, and a growing uneasiness continued to take hold of me that I couldn't place. Something about the call just felt wrong. Police are on the way, I began. I tried to infuse the statement with my usual level of assertiveness and confidence, but I worried that the uneasiness may be audible in my voice. You tell me your name? I asked. Amber. All right, Amber, are you or can you get somewhere safe? A room with a door you can lock? I'm in my room, she said through sniffles, and it was obvious that she had been crying profusely. I locked the door. Good, I'm gonna stay with you on the line. Is there anywhere for you to hide? The sound of footsteps grew in the background as her voice lowered to a whisper. I think under the bed, she whimpered. Okay, is there... I paused, thinking over my words before continuing. Anything you can use to protect yourself? There was silence on her end for a moment, followed by a hushed, "Yes!" as she dropped the phone, I assumed to get a weapon. The clamor from within the house had grown closer to the phone, and the piercing ringing sound had returned. I was almost certain there had to be something wrong with my headset or with Amber's phone, and the sound grew to an almost unbearable extent, matched only by deafening thuds from somewhere on the phone. It sounded too close. I could feel the hairs begin to rise on the back of my neck, and the ominous sense of panic began to give way to an unexplained fear. The urge to look over my shoulder grew harder to fight as the persistent thudding sound grew louder, nearer. It all sounded too clear, I guess. There was no static, none of the white noise typical of a phone call. Nothing. Just the sound of footsteps approaching closer, closer. I gave in to my instinct, whipping around in my seat, nearly losing my headset. No one. I had no time to settle my nerves, as Amber returned to the line. Are you there? She whispered, yanking me from my fog and back into the moment. Yes, I replied. I struggled to shake off my fears. Something was very wrong with this situation. Despite my worries, I shifted my attention back to Amber. There isn't any weapon, the girl muttered, but I have something. There was a pause. Okay, what do you have? I asked, realizing my prompt was necessary. A rabbit, a pink rabbit, she said, and even over the phone I could hear a little embarrassment. My dad gave her to me when I was little, she sniffled. He said she would keep me safe. I didn't know what to say for a moment, but didn't want to miss a beat. He was right, I said, as encouragingly as I could. Everyone knows pink bunnies are great protection. Can you go back under? I was interrupted. Amber, I miss you. I could hear a man call from within the house. So the intruder knew her? I furrowed my brow. Amber, do you recognize that voice? I asked, hoping she could identify the intruder. There was silence for a moment before her response. It sounds like my dad. Why does it sound like my dad? I blinked. What do you mean? That's my daddy's voice. Why does it have my daddy's voice? I didn't know how to respond to that. Hell, I didn't know what to think about. Had his voice? Before I could ask what she meant, we were interrupted by a sound. The thing we heard has taken me years to try to understand. I've come to believe it was that things laugh. At the time, though, we couldn't know. It was the sound of metal crunching in a car accident as it met flesh, a wet, grinding shriek that shook me to my core. I wanted to vomit, and my vision began to blur. I can only imagine what it was like for Amber, hearing that all in person. Amber, I panted, my senses returning to me all at once. She barely had time to respond before we heard it, a voice, or voices, calling for her from somewhere nearby. They spoke as one, all with the same odd, inhumane nature, dripping with malintent. Amber, my blood froze. Amber began to cry, and her cries eventually becoming pleas, as she begged for help, her life, her mother, and my intervention. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes, I muttered, mentally cursing the timer which displayed the estimated arrival time of the dispatched officers. I prayed it would be soon enough. I sighed. The room, she whispered, her voice one of utter panic, before breaking into a quiet sob. I silently swore under my breath, Amber, I need you to hide right now if possible. The police are 3 minutes away. Stay as quiet as possible. There was no response, but I assumed from the shuffling sounds I could hear that she had gone back under the bed. For a few moments there was silence. Then Amber spoke and my heart dropped. I'm going to die. You are not going to die, Amber, I began, worry now audible in my voice. I promise. It's reaching under the door. Oh my God, she muttered. There was a crash, louder than before, and Amber began to shriek. The noises continued, and it began to dawn on me what I was hearing. It was breaking down the bedroom door. Amber's screams had devolved into horrified babbling, and pleas for her life to whatever was on the other side of the door. Her screams were soon drowned out by the same noise as before, that sick, fucking laughter. I'm burping. Are you okay? Amber shrieked, loud enough to make my ears ring. Please, what are you? Appreciate, it mocked, in a voice that was some sick parody of Ember's. Panic gripped me as I glanced back at the corner of the monitor, displaying the dispatched unit's arrival time. 1:36. Please God, let it be soon enough. Amber, are you there? I called. Amber! As suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Somewhere in the distance, I heard sirens. I hear them, Amber. Officers are a minute away. Silence. My heart began to sink. Amber, are you there? I could hear something shifting, breathing. I think it's gone, Amber said. A surge of relief rolled through me, and I let out a sigh and leaned back in the chair. 12:27, the dispatch time read, and the sirens in the background grew louder. You did very well, Amber. Police are almost there. You did really well. I couldn't think of what else to say. I'd never had a call like this, and something about it all felt so strange. Something Amber had said began to ring in my mind. What are you? Amber? I began. What did you see? I was met with silence. Amber? Amber began to laugh. Amber? I said, my voice pleading, a wave of realization crashing down on me. The laughter grew more raucous and less human with every second. Somewhere in the background, there was a knocking sound. They'd finally arrived. Too late. I asked the only thing I could think at the moment. Why? The laughter stopped abruptly as the thing on the phone spoke. It was fun. There was a click and the line went dead. The house was empty when officers arrived. No signs of forced entry anywhere except the door to Amber's bedroom, the bottom of which had been torn away by something, leaving a wide space to crawl beneath. And Amber, or what was left of her, decorated the room. Whatever had been there left nothing behind to identify it, only carnage. The case was never officially closed, and everyone had their theories as to what had happened that day, ranging from serial killers to a bear attack and everything in between. The call was never made public, not my decision, but not one I necessarily complained about either. I never want to hear that recording again. I put in my 2 weeks' notice that same night, though I never returned to work after that day. So, I did a search for anything I went to school for 2 years ago, and I'd been content to try and forget about that call. As callous as it may sound, I was content trying to forget about Amber, to forget whatever I had spoken to on that phone, but I don't think it's done with me. Last night I dreamed, or had thought I was dreaming, the sounds of footsteps running throughout my house. As something screeched and laughed and mocked me, just outside my bedroom door. I stayed in my bed long into the morning despite the sounds having stopped, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and confusion, until eventually I convinced myself to leave the bed. I crossed the room, cursing every creak the floor made under my weight. I lowered myself to the ground, holding my breath, as I peered under my bedroom door. There was something there, but it wasn't moving. I mustered up the little bravery I had left and rose to my feet, my eyes shut tight, and a prayer on my lips. I pulled open my bedroom door slightly and stuck my head out just enough to see what lay outside. I stifled a gasp, and tears flooded my eyes as I bent over to pick up the object. Placed right outside my door was a little pink bunny, covered in dark stains. From somewhere within the darkness just beyond the bedroom door, Amber's laughter echoed.